see. Let's just stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance, shall we? Stand if you're able. Great, carried out like the true leaders that you are. All right, we will move now to item number 3, acknowledgments, announcements, and correspondence. Mr. Houlimard.
Yes, Chair Parker, today we have a few announcements of common interest. Just a reminder for the board, we did send a note out to the public and to the board that item 8B on our agenda today will be postponed until next month, since MCWD General Manager Keith Vandermountain is out of town and couldn't do that today, so we're going to postpone that. Next item is about the Honor Our Fallen Run. I see Robert Norris and Tom Mancini are out in the hall. Both of them know that they'll be participating active in the Honor Our Fallen Run. That'll be Saturday, October 20th for its 5 and 10K run. It'll start at Fort Ord Dunes State Park. I understand that the dunes are still looking for volunteers. On Tuesday, October 23rd, the ACE Innovation and Entrepreneurship gathering is going to occur in this region. This is America's Competitiveness Exchange. It's sponsored by the United States Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration, and it brings a number of senior level business, government policy, and economic decision makers into the region. Several members of this board will be participating. That includes many public-private partnerships, and it talks about the best practices that are in this region and how they reflect with others in and around the world. On Saturday, October 27th, will be the 9th annual Heroes Open at the Black Horse Bayonet Golf Course. Thank you, City of Seaside, for making that available for the Heroes Open. The benefit tournament is going to help for the cemetery expansion. I met with Senator Monning and others today that talked about the cemetery expansion at the Veteran Transition Center. The fact that we have $3 million that came out of the budget that helps the cemetery for phase 2 is great, but we still need private dollars for the private events that will happen on the cemetery. And so the Heroes Open is still looking for golfers. Is that right, Robert Norris? And then also on the 27th, another important event is happening the same day. Our colleagues at the Bureau of Land Management are conducting a Fort Ord National Public Lands Day event. There'll be a celebration at the monument, and this will be a wonderful volunteer event. It starts, I believe, at 9 a.m. in the morning. Chair Parker, that's all I have under announcements and correspondence.
Thank you. Thank you. Next item of business is to go into closed session, and if Authority Council would tell us about what we're going to be, and the public, what we're going to be discussing in closed session.
Yes, thank you, Chair, members of the board, and public. Item 4A, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Keep Fort Ord Wild versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court case number 17CV4540. That's a pending litigation matter. 4B, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Marina Community Partners LLC versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court case number 18CV871. It's also a matter of pending litigation. And 4C, conference with legal counsel, potential litigation, Government Code Section 54956.9D4.
Great, thank you. Is there any public comment on any of the items to be discussed in closed session? Seeing none, we will recess to closed session and return as soon as we are able. reconvene the October 12th, 2018 meeting of the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. Council, could you read us out of closed session, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair Parker, and members of the board and public. The board met in closed session under items 4A through C, heard from council on each one of the items, and took council's advice, and there's nothing to report out on 4A, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, keep Fort Ord wild versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority. It's a pending litigation. 4B, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Marina Community Partners LLC versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority. Nothing to report on that matter. And 4C, conference with legal counsel, potential litigation, Government Code Section 54956.9 D4. Nothing to report on that.
Thank you. Thank you. We will move now to roll call. Madam Clerk.
Supervisor Parker,
Here.
Supervisor Alejo, Supervisor Adams, Mayor Edelin, Councilmember O'Connell, Councilmember Morton, Councilmember Hoffa, Councilmember Pacheco, Mayor Carbone, Mayor Gunter, Councilmember Garfield,
Here.
Councilmember Reimers,
Here.
Kathleen Lee, Nicole Hollingsworth, Erica Parker, Todd Muck, Dr. Diffenbaugh, Steve Matarazzo, Andre Lewis, Colonel Ford, Bill Collins, Dr. Tribely, Lisa Reinheimer, and Dr. Moore. You have a quorum.
Thank you. We'll move next to the consent agenda. Is there any member of the board who would like to pull any of the items for question or comment? Yes.
Just have a question on 7D, the environmental ESCA. This week also we received in an email the administrative ruling. I just thought maybe a public comment on what the impact of that was would be informative both to the board and to the public. If somebody would share. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to pull any of the consent calendar items? Yes, 7F. All right, and is that for discussion, some questions? Okay, thank you. Any member of the public wishing to pull any item off of consent that hasn't already been pulled? All right, thank you. I think let's go ahead and speak to the ESCA question, and then once we get that response, I would entertain a motion to move the consent agenda except for 7F, and then we'll move that to after our scheduled item 8. Yeah, so it would end up being 8B on the agenda.
Yes, I think the question was related to the information that everyone received about Group 1 and Group 4 in the records of decision that were announced this week. And that just means those are done. There's still work to be done with respect to our land use covenant implementation plan, operation, and maintenance plan. Stan, you want to give any detail?
Yes, all of the ESCA properties have records of decisions now. That's a milestone. It's not a milestone that gets us very far. We still need the land use control implementation, operation, and maintenance plans accepted by the regulatory agencies. That is in progress, and that's actually a very nice update to the text in the report.
Thank you for that. Would anyone like to make a motion to adopt the consent calendar minus 7F? Thank
Second.
you. Motion by Alejo, seconded by Adams. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. That passes unanimously. We will move now to our business item. This has to do with the Habitat Conservation Plan.
Yes, Chair Parker, members of the board, and the public. This item is a follow on to the workshop that was conducted by staff for the board just a couple of weeks ago. In fact, several of the members of the board asked us some rather intriguing questions about the Habitat Conservation Plan and its relationship to the Habitat Management Plan, and how those things work side by side, how one process works, what the obligations and responsibilities are of jurisdictions that way, and then on the other side, what those would be, the different financing and cost models, along with how do you do incidental take permits under each program. Jonathan's going to give you a reprise of portions of his presentation last time, and today we're really looking for the board to give us some direction with respect to how we can continue with the HCP and the process, along with moving ahead with efforts to pull together a joint powers authority now or later in some form or fashion. And so we're looking for that direction today. Jonathan?
Thank you. Chair Parker, members of the board and public, thank you for the opportunity today to present on the HCP and set the stage on the recommendations for your consideration. These topics, the presentation is going to cover much of what was covered at the special September 24th board meeting on the HCP, but not all hope is lost. There's something new in this presentation as well. So the board had asked for bringing back a number of slides to include a hypothetical project example, how to go through a permitting process of a hypothetical project. So that's included in this presentation. And I'll keep this informative and moving here. So, first off, just wanted to give some background on the HMP and the HCP. So the Army trained soldiers heavily on Fort Ord for nearly 80 years. There was a lot of effects on the natural lands, trenches dug, foxholes dug, heavy equipment on these natural lands, but the species kept coming back. They've been very, very resilient. And there's some very rare and special habitats here. So in terms of the HMP, when the Army went for closure, they had to talk to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the closure plan. They needed to also take coverage for the cleanup activities. So the HMP was devised as that method for the Army to do the land transfers and their cleanup. So it didn't provide take permits for the rest of us, but it helped the Army to move ahead with their cleanup. And then also, we also have some requirements as takers of that land. So with the habitat reserves, the land owners of those reserves have habitat requirements. Also, landowners next to the Fort Ord National Monument have borderland requirements as well. So if this was going to be a race, the HMP is a half marathon, the HCP would be a full marathon. So the HMP took us much closer to an HCP, but didn't take us all the way to the finish line. So in terms of the HCP in 2019, we have funding in the HCP to manage the reserve system. That's the FORA CFD. We have federal and state incidental take permits within HCP, which are not afforded with the HMP. And you have a joint powers authority to manage the annual expenditures and ensure that the HCP is complied with. Right, so here we just have a list. So the top of the list is the list of signatories to the HMP. We have in italics a number of entities like York School and California Department of Transportation that are not part of the HCP permittee list. The Caltrans did not choose to participate, for example, in the HCP. The longer list below is the 2019 HCP. These would be the permittees for the HCP. And note here that BLM is a cooperating entity. They do not require permits from the HCP. Okay, on to the summary. This is just to quickly summarize differences between the HMP and the HCP. So in terms of the HMP, it moved us further down the road by establishing the habitat reserves and requiring management of those reserves. The HCP would still require more in detailed resource management plans, so they both require resource management plans, but the HCP is going to require some quite detailed ones. And also it'll have, whereas the HMP had deed restrictions on the property for habitat, parcels, the HCP is also going to require conservation easements. So in terms of other steps here, we'd have monitoring under both. The HMP requires monitoring. The HCP requires species-specific and monitoring and habitat restoration targets. So you're going from a degree of somewhat specificity with the HMP to very precise actions that we needed to take in the HCP. As well with borderlands, the HMP requires borderland management activities along the Fort Ord National Monument. The HCP would require those requirements along each of the HMAs, not just the National Monument. And then funding-wise, the obligations are that whoever owns the habitat lands and their HMP is going to fund management on those properties. The HCP has that taken care of through developer funding, paying the CFD. Okay, in terms of benefits, so benefits, the deed restrictions over the habitat reserves and HMP program allowed the Army to transfer the lands and conduct the cleanup activities. The HCP takes it a step further with the HCP program. The conservation easements over the habitat reserves provide additional assurances to the wildlife agencies, providing for covered activities that may result in take in the reserves and in development lands. Similarly, with the HMP, it has fewer specifications for habitat management and reporting, whereas the HCP has detailed monitoring and reporting, which can be used to improve the management of the reserves. The HMP funding is dependent on the landowner's budgets, and the HCP funding is set up through the CFD and its replacement. And then under the HMP, development lands have no HMP requirements, except if it's a borderland that's abutting the Fort Ord National Monument. The HCP would provide incidental take permits when development occurs and borderland management occurs. So you need a permit whenever you affect one of these protected species, whether it's a state-listed plant or a federal animal species such as California tiger salmon. Okay, so quick update here on our process on the HCP. Back in April of this year, there was a memorandum from the Department of Interior. They imposed a completion limit, so we have until April of 2019 to finish any EISs, environmental impact statements, that are under preparation. It also required a reduction in page size, page numbers. So there's a limit of 150 pages and 300 pages if it's a complex document. With HCP, we fall into the category of complex, so we have a 300-page limit for our EIS, EIR. And we're using this momentum as part of this process to streamline our timeline for the HCP. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is working with us to meet that timeline. Okay, so what does that mean? So it means that right now we have the final screen check review by the solicitor. They're reviewing the HCP and the feedback for us in the next week or two. That means once we get that feedback, we can prepare a public review draft HCP, and we're looking for that to go out to the public in November or December this year. And then in terms of the next step, you would form the HCP JPA. We'd have to issue a ROD by April, and then we would have permits by June or July. Okay, this is just a map showing where the habitat reserves are located. The big green area on the southeast is the Fort Ord National Monument. That's 14,500 acres. It's the largest habitat reserve on the base. And these reserves weren't chosen at random. They were chosen based on where the species are present. So part of the HMP was to set up this reserve system, preserve the most precious resources of habitat, connect the reserves together. It's a very integrated program to maximize potential for species to persist into the future. All right, so here's a map just to go over jurisdiction by jurisdiction, their development acreages, and then also their habitat management area acreages. Just to note here, these are an estimate of what remains for Fort Ord development lands. So that's the second column. And the third column is the acreages excluding development that is allowed in these habitat reserves. Just want to clarify that take of endangered plants and animals on these lands requires a permit called an incidental take permit. And whether it's a base-wide permit or an individual project permit to develop in these areas, you'd have to get that permit as part of that development process. And just to note that often in the case of the plants, the acreage is equal to or double that of the removed species in the habitat that's necessary for mitigation. So you need to mitigate 10 acres of a special state-listed plant like Sangilia. Typically you have to do it at a ratio of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. So that means for 10 acres, you're going to preserve 30 acres somewhere else. And we'll get into that in just a moment here on the example. So I just want to show here the occurrence maps. So this is Sangilia. It's roughly found in the habitat reserves, but it's not always found in the habitat reserves. It's outside the reserves as well. And this is just to show its extent on Fort Ord. And then Sangilia, another state-listed plant that requires a permit. This one, as well, is roughly the majority of its range is within habitat reserves, but does go outside the reserves as well.
Jonathan, I think this one's Seaside Birdsby.
I'm sorry, yes, Seaside's Birdsby. And finally, just an example of an animal, California tiger salamander. And this has two types of habitat, aquatic habitat, which you can kind of see with the red and the blue. Those are the different vernal pools where the salamander has its breeding habitat. And then the upland habitat is the yellow or the orange. And it's roughly a range of 2.2 kilometers that most of the salamanders will find mammal burrows and have that part of their life cycle. Okay, so on to the hypothetical project. So we're going to pick on Seaside. But this is called a parcel in Seaside East. It's E24. It's 198 acres. Just for rough numbers, we're going to say it's 200 acres in this example. That is existing Seaside, and General Jim Moore is within the green area, which is Fort Ord, and then the monument's the blue parcel that's to the east. All right, so looking at this hypothetical project, we know there's some listed species in the area within the parcel. California tiger salamander, Seaside's birdsbeak, and Sangilia. So two state-listed plants, one federally listed animal. So looking at the process, how would Seaside or a developer obtain incidental take permits without an HCP? So we have 5 steps here. Step 1 would be conduct surveys. Step 2 would be to identify potential impacts. Step 3 would be consider your options. Step 4 would be to choose an option, and step 5 would be to submit permit applications. So we may want to also note that if you're looking at CTS, you would do a present absence survey first. So if you could prove that there's no CTS found in the ground, you could take that forward to wildlife agencies and seek their concurrence with that. But let's just assume for this example that we do the surveys and we find that all the species are present. Okay, so just for this example, we're going to hypothetically say the results show that there's 200 acres of CTS habitat and 100 acres of Seaside's birdsbeak and Sangilia impacted. So we would generate some options. Some options might be these 3 options. One is to reduce the impacts by developing fewer acres. So if you're developing fewer acres, you have to mitigate for less acres. Another option could be to secure 600 acres of CTS upland habitat on Fort Ord and secure 300 acres of Seaside's birdsbeak and Sangilia habitat. Where would you look for that? You would probably look in the county of Monterey. You'd look in MPC and their habitat reserves. City Marina has some habitat reserves. UC also has habitat reserves. Another option, option 3, would be the same as option 2, except you could, for CTS mitigation, you could secure that by purchasing CTS mitigation bank credits. So there is a mitigation bank for CTS that Fort Ord is eligible for. And just want to note that That mitigation bank has limits, so it's currently less than 1,800 acres that are available. It depends as people buy more, as entities buy more of that mitigation bank, less is available for others. An estimate of a credit is $50,000 for an acre, so that would put roughly between $10 to $30 million just to secure CTS permits if you went for option 3. All right, so looking at a hypothetical project, just wanted to note here that project still has HMP requirements. So you would have no habitat management required in the parcel itself. You'd have perhaps some interim management just to keep non-native species control in check as it borders with the national monument, the border national monument. And then you'd also, long-term wise, have some borderland management requirements. So there'd be a need to install and maintain barriers to natural areas, have some fire-resistant land uses located along that interface, have structures sited behind this buffer between that interface, and then also have to take measures to reduce the potential erosion into the border national monument. Okay, so just moving on to the HCP and the transition plan. The transition task force earlier had expressed the desire to tie up these loose ends, HCP being one of them. So the idea here is that the transition plan should have a recipient organization for the HCP responsibilities in place. So that could just be an entity to implement the HMP and receive FORA CFD funding if the HCP effort is not successful. Also, we've got some suggestions on the JPA formation. So we could form the HMP JPA in the next few months. That could be an option. It could be a fail-safe in case the 2019 HCP JPA is not in place by June of 2020. The JPA could amend its purpose in the future if the HCP is successful. Or another option could be to have a trigger date by which, if there's no HCP, the landholders agree to begin forming an HMP JPA. Okay, so some other considerations. If the HCP is approved, early formation of the JPA wouldn't be necessary. We right now have the streamlined federal EIS process that moves the permit issuance. We're looking at June 2019. So forming a JPA and then amending its purpose could create some extra steps for multiple public agencies. So that's just something to consider. And finally, just setting the stage for the board's recommendation today. First recommendation is to receive the status report. The second recommendation is to consider directing staff to work with the jurisdictions on formation of a JPA to implement base-wide habitat management activities required by the 1997 HMP. Should the board direct staff to form a JPA to implement the HMP, you may consider including a target date for forming the JPA, and just as a suggestion, July 31st, 2019. So, any questions?
Any questions from board members? Director Evelyn.
Yeah. Jonathan, outstanding presentation. You've got something we can sink our teeth in. There's some meat on that presentation. It seems like at first glance, and not having a chance to think about some of the implications of what you're saying, we're looking at almost 40 million right now short for the HCP. We were talking about that, assuming full build out. And looking at the 1 to 3 ratio or 1 to 2 ratio, whatever else, it seems what you're saying for land use jurisdictions, if we can't come up with that $40 million, if the land use jurisdictions cut back, it's based on the actual size of the footprint by acreage. It seems like by reducing the amount of acreage developed on and maybe going up and having high density, you can minimize the amount of money being spent on mitigation for the HCP and have your cake and eat it too as far as amount of TOT and other taxes generated for the underlying jurisdiction. Am I missing something there?
That's true. The less take you have to undertake, the less you would pay for mitigations.
Any other board members with questions at this point? Mr. Hama.
Yeah, you showed a slide that showed the developable land for the various jurisdictions and then the habitat management area. And for the city of Monterey, it showed 0 habitat management area. I know that there's some Yaden's piperia, I think is how you pronounce it, I'm not sure. Piperia. So my question is, why, is that just sort of a rounding error because it's it's like on an acre, or what, could you explain that?
Yeah, the Yaden's parcel in the city of Monterey is a development parcel, but it does have a high concentration of Yaden's on that parcel. So it's a federally listed plant. It's not a state listed plant. So essentially, what's required of a federal permit, the permitting protections under the Federal Endangered Species Act are not as strong as the state for listed plants. So the act of transferring the land is considered safe by the federal government.
Okay. And then, so Fish and Wildlife has determined that collectively we have certain millions of dollars of mitigation we have to set aside in this fund, and it's kind of grown over time. Is it now essentially fixed, or will it be fixed once they finally approve our plan?
Yes, yeah, part of the approval would be they would agree to our endowment.
Okay, and then the last question that I have is, you mentioned that if we don't establish a JPA by 2020, that the Florida Reuse Authority could come up with some fail-safe, but what exactly does that mean? What exactly would a fail-safe be?
So one fail-safe could be to set up a joint powers authority to implement the HMP. And so they would be the recipient of FORA CFD dollars, which we estimate would be about $21 million at 2020. And they could use that funding to do the management that's required of the property owners of habitat reserves. They could also use some of that funding to get jurisdictions through some permitting if that's the desire of that JPA as well.
But what if we don't, what if a JPA is not created by that time? I thought you said that there were some options. One of them was a fail-safe, but it wasn't really clear to me what that meant.
Okay. So there's the HCP JPA. If there's no HCP JPA created, the option would be, we'll form one to implement the HMP, something that's required now. And that's one fail-safe. Another could be to distribute CFD dollars to jurisdictions.
Any other board members? Yes, Director Moore and Mr. Morrison.
So Jonathan, going back to the slide where you had the 3 options, one of them you referred to was bank credits. And that, I thought you said there's 1,800 acres in the bank.
Yes.
And so somebody could pay $50,000, you're hypothetical, somebody could pay approximately $50,000 per acre, generating 10 to 30 million. Does that money is going into the HCP fund, HMP fund? Where is that money going?
So this is
It wasn't clear to me.
Yeah, so just describing the scenario a little bit more. So we're saying there's no HCP, but you still need a permit to develop this property.
Right.
So an option could be, there's a regional mitigation bank for California tiger salamander. You pay money into the bank to get a credit. So right now, a recent example is that an acre costs $50,000. So if this is a 200-acre piece of property, that would mean about $10 to $30 million to just pay into the bank to get your permit.
So what you're saying is that if you needed 10 acres, you're going to get 10 of the 1,800 acres. And are the 1,800 acres the habitat management conservation area that's, what acreage are you talking about,
Okay,
number
so,
one?
So, yeah.
I'm trying to really, it's not on Fort
Yeah,
Ord, you're
yeah.
just paying for it someplace else?
Correct.
And I should be in this business. Okay, so the developer is just paying for its take permit.
Correct.
Okay, that's trying to associate what my answers were here, where that money was going. And then I did have a question about, currently there's the 13.8 million approximately collected for this fund, you're anticipating 20 million by 2020. My question is 20 million satisfactory funding to our best estimate to fulfill our obligations under the HMP? Or are we short, or might we have an overage?
There has not been a cost estimate of what it costs to implement the HMP. We know that just by track experience, what it costs BLM, what it costs state parks to implement their HMP requirements. So we could do a rough estimate, a thumb scale estimate, and bring that back to the board if that's what you'd like.
And a third entity, isn't UC doing some management currently for some acreage? That would be a third place for us to look at what it costs
Yes.
per acre to do.
Yes.
So it would seem prudent that we would take a look at that so we know how far our 20 million is going to go.
When we talk about setting this up for these different programs, we've done some rather detailed work, including assessing all of the experience we have on Fort Ord, as well as experience that people have had elsewhere in the region, and we work specifically with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Fish and Wildlife, who know about the same kinds of costs all throughout the state. So the numbers that we have are predicated on all of those assumptions, and so they test that. Plus, there's another factor that has to do with how much money goes into an endowment, how much it's going to kick out each year, and how much it pays. So there are a number of factors involved there. I think our current staff, it's easy to say this: we don't have anywhere near the amount of dollars, no matter which process you take, to finish all of the habitat across the base and do it in a restorative way, in an enhanced way, in order to be able to get the kind of permits we need for the combination of intensified development and trails development that we want to do on Fort Ord. That we know. But if you want us to put more numbers on, we can be, if you give us a estimate range of 10%, we can probably get something to you pretty quickly.
So just in follow-up to that question, we're already mandatorily required to do the HMP. So at this point, I can't say that and I may be the only director that doesn't know, what is the anticipated cost? And if we're going to have 20 million, what will that anticipate generate as income? So the specific obligations that need to be fulfilled under the HMP solely is anticipated to cost 2 million a year, 1 million a year, 15 million, I don't have an idea. And what can we generate with 20 million? Because if the 20 million is not satisfactory to generate sufficient funds just to fulfill our HMP, we should be addressing that while we still have 18 months and not 2 months. We might have to take some of our CFD monies and increase that contribution, and we should be addressing that quickly. Thank you for letting me make my question.
Thank you. Mr. Matarazzo and then Dr. Moore.
I think an important point was made at the prior meeting that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife agree with the HCP as it stands. So all the mitigations in the HCP with the CFD funds will fund all mitigation. That's important. What Jonathan didn't mention, although he did in a roundabout way, is all the requirements he mentioned for the single project requires a separate HCP. Those have to be into a separate HCP, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife look at that. Hopefully it won't take 20 years, but it normally takes 1 or 2, and if it involves, my understanding from talking to biologists, if it involves the potential for a California tiger salamander, you have to do a 2-year study under 2 rainy seasons. You have to do drift fencing on your entire property with traps to see if any California tiger salamander are caught. So I think the point that was made at the prior meeting, which I tend to agree with, is there's a lot of uncertainty there. You've gone through 20 years of the HCP and you're getting certainty. And to answer Gail's question is, the HCP, if it's approved, the regulatory agencies understand that there's funding for about 21 million when it's approved in 2020 or 2021. And then the CFD funds, as development occurs, will fund the rest of it over time. That's real important. So, equally important in this presentation is get a funding mechanism so you don't have to worry about that. You know, I would say right now, continue the CFD.
Thank you. Dr. Moore?
So, question on this $50,000 per acre and the 1,800. Is that charge vary by the species for which you need a take permit? And is the amount of available land varying based on the species involved?
So this is a regional mitigation bank that was just set up within the last 6 months. So we're within that mitigation bank area. That's why we could buy credits from it in order to develop an area with CTS. 50,000 was just an example of one entity that had to buy a credit. It cost them 50,000. That's why I'm using that as an example.
Any idea how that was calculated?
It's a bank, so I think someone was saying, "Hey, I'll put this land aside. Okay, how much is it going to cost you?" But the bank sets up those transactions. As individuals, we don't need to set up the transactions.
And then a second question, could you briefly enumerate the powers and responsibilities of this envisioned JPA?
Could I enumerate the powers and
Responsibilities. I mean, what would board members be asked to say yay or nay on?
So the JPA could be given the power to manage all the habitat reserves, the non-federal, non-state reserves. So that's quite a significant number of acres on the base to manage. You need to develop resource management plans on each of those properties, which would tell you which habitat management activities you'll be doing on an annual basis, if there's any areas to restore, trails to repair, to do that kind of work. It looks at the resources present, areas where there's invasive species control that's needed, the best ways to manage the property. So the JPA could have hire a staff to do that. They could contract with another entity to provide those services, but that would be one of the responsibilities of the JPA board, to manage the land, provide annual reports required under the HMP.
So today, since we've had a number of projects that must have gotten take permits, is it us that's in the driver's seat on that right now?
So the individual take permits, those are controlled by whoever owns that permit. So for example, Marina Heights had a permit, they developed some land, they had to put money down for that permit in order to develop. That's a different issue than managing habitat for the HMP.
You know, if the board members may recall, we did distribute, and as on our website, you can get the draft of the JPA agreement that talks about powers and other things. That's on our website, and the Transition Task Force, I think, got copies of it as well. So it's out there if you want to take a look.
Any other questions from board members? I did have a question. So I'm trying to make sure I understand. So it appears that you're saying that, I mean, we're aiming for an HCP right now, and it looks like we may have approval as early as April next year. I was a little confused because previously there was some discussion that we would need to start now to begin the process of setting up a JPA to implement the HCP. Now it appears to me you're saying, no, we don't have to worry about it because somehow when it gets approved or adopted, that then there will be a JPA? I couldn't understand that.
No, I'm sorry if I came across saying there's no need for JPA under the scenario of an HCP. It's just it happens after the approval of the HCP.
Okay, so we can't get a head start on that JPA now to have the formation of the JPA coincide with the approval of the HCP.
Right. So
Okay.
the entity shouldn't be set up before the CEQA is done, the NEPA is done.
Got it. Okay, I understand that now. And so if we don't have an approved HCP by June or July of next year, then we would look at the option of setting up a JPA because we still have to do the HMP. Okay, great. I understand that now. Good. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for public comment. Is there anyone in the public who has a question or a comment on this item? Okay, I don't see anyone coming forward, so we have before us receiving the report and then giving direction to staff. Is there any discussion on this at the moment? And I think the way it was left was if we have an HCP that is approved by spring, summer of next year, we would proceed with forming a JPA at that time. But I guess staff is asking for direction from the board. If we don't have something in place by June 30th or July 31st of next year in the way of an HCP, do we want to set that as a trigger date, or do we want to set another trigger date to start looking at a JPA for the HMP? So yes, Mr. Hoffa and then Ms. Reimers.
So even though we can't establish the JPA until after the approval, it seems to me that discussions to start to formulate what representation would look like, what obligations might be, I don't think you would want to wait for those negotiations until that point. They should start sooner than that. I'm not sure when, but I would just say you'd want to have the outline of a plan ready to be adopted shortly after the HCP is approved.
I'm reacting to the ABC choices that are in the report. So it would seem to me that A would be to form the JPA, cooperative according to the current HCP schedule, which would be March and April. I understand now that the JPA doesn't need to come before the HCP, but I would agree with Mr. Hoffa and say that we need to begin all of the processes and go forward with the HCP, but be ready then with the discussions for the JPA.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Ms. Garfield.
Thank you. This is a new Department of the Interior requirement that things be responded to within a certain number of days. Is that correct? What happens if they don't do their part?
Well, the Department of the Interior, I think the Secretary issued this new guidance that says that these processes have to be completed in a 12-month period, but under any circumstance by April of 2019. Is that correct, Jonathan? So this is new guidance from the new administration on getting these things off the table and moving. Wasn't always true in the past. There wasn't a timeline. So this is a new timeline.
I get that, but they don't have much practice in meeting those timelines because it's new. And so I'm kind of wondering is if they don't do their part, do we get what we want? I mean, is the default the plan that was submitted and they lose an opportunity to, just wondering what happens if, because it could happen.
So a number of, we're not the only EIS CIR out there that's been pending at the point where the order came out. So others have tried to get extensions, they've been denied. So if we're really close to getting our process done and say we missed it by a week, it would probably, I mean, just theoretically, the world wouldn't end. But there's been no guidance about what the hammer is if you don't meet these deadlines. So everybody's working with us trying to meet the deadline.
All right, Ms. Morton.
So it would seem prudent to me, from the standpoint of the City of Marina, in looking at a JPA, whether it's for an HMP or an HCP, our concern is to make sure that we generate the funds to fulfill this obligation from development. And that's part of what we've taken the initiative about in entering into contracts with our developers that are already previously entitled when FORA sunsets to collect the funds to fulfill these obligations. And so Marina does look forward to working with the other jurisdictions in their cooperation in the same way. What I want to state is what the City of Marina's concern is to jump into a JPA for either one of these obligations. And I heard this also at the subcommittee, the Fort Ord subcommittee of the county's legal counsel, is the need to be sure that we're not obligating general fund monies. And when I'm the task force sitting through many of these conversations, there was this phrase used that means something more to Jonathan and to Michael than I can interpret, is the stay ahead. And the stay ahead means that at one point in the task force there was the idea that we needed 28 million in this fund. In 2017, at the task force we were talking about we needed to have 28 million in there for, I don't remember if it was the state or the federal, to sign off on it by time we sunset. And we now are predicting we're going to have 20 million. And that kind of uncertainty is what makes it hard, I think, for Marina. I'm not going to speak for every other jurisdiction, but if I was looking at your budgets, that I would be concerned also if the obligation to stay ahead fell on our general funds. So it's really important, I think, that we continue to move this forward, but going back to understanding how much money is necessary just for the HMP, and then what's the leap in the amount of money for the aspirational HCP. And to Director Moore's comment that much development, not much, some development has happened, and those developers have done their take permits as required under state law. If the HCP is not going forward, everybody's development will take an incidental take permit. It's just a different process. As Steve did point out, it may take a year, may take 2 years. So I would like to have some more information about money, and then going forward with the discussion then, if it's the HMP, 20 million, what's our shortfall, and what would be the idea of how that would be allocated if the county has the majority of that property? If we enter into a JPA, are we coordinating? Are we looking at distributing that money to whoever has habitat management? What would that look like? I don't have a handle on that. I don't think a lot of us do.
Yes, Mr. Hoffa.
So I would just point out that some of that uncertainty would be relieved in the event of a FORA light extension, where we will continue to have the CFP that will be able to meet the HCP needs. I also wanted to comment on the bank, the mitigation bank, and it seems to me that there are two risks there. From a practical standpoint, the risk is that the bank gets expended before a particular project is able to pay into the bank. But from an environmental standpoint, those of us who care about our local environment, I think, should see that as a really bad alternative, because that money is going to go into a state fund that may never end up being spent for habitat conservation here, where the actual impact's happening. So I don't think that is really a good alternative for those of us who care about the environment.
Great, yes, Director Garfield.
Thank you. One last thing. It just is concerning to me is I don't understand the format of, if you have this many acres and then you have that many other acres that can be used to offset. And are there any jurisdictions that would be unable to do development because they wouldn't have the means within their control to offset a likely take? And if so, is there any way to make that fair, or are some people just out of luck?
That's a good question. So that's why I picked on Seaside, because they don't have habitat reserves in Seaside. So they would have to.
In order for Seaside to develop it, they don't have the means within their span of control to do an offset. The only two means open to them would be to reduce their development to the point where don't have any to offset, then they're reduce their development to zero, or somehow purchase these acres in this imaginary fund that's going to do something, or make a deal with a neighbor. Can you make a deal with a neighbor?
Yes, you can. Yes.
And we're doing so well with that. So I'm just wondering, I mean, I appreciate knowing that would we got some people that are really going to be hurting and can't do what they want to do because it's across boundaries. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Moderato, and then Director Reimers.
Yeah, picking on Seaside again, we really don't know the exact habitat issues on that 200-acre parcel. So you do the habitat conservation plan, and the agencies can come back and say, yeah, 50% of it has to be open space for habitat. So 99% of developers want off-site habitat. So that's part of the beauty, if you will, of the HCP. That everything, it's gone back 20 years, right? There's developable areas and there's habitat management areas. These developable areas, like the 200 acres, is seen as full development. No habitat mitigation on site. So that's the benefit of the area-wide HCP. If you do a single HCP, it takes a lot of review. 20% of the property, since there's no off-site mitigation anywhere else, 20%, 50%, 90% has to be habitat. And your project that had 1,000 dwelling units in it now has 100.
Thank you. Director Reimers.
As I understand, the HCP is now moving along in a place where we could meet the March-April date. So I see no reason to delay that process. I recognize the need for money. I don't know. There may be other choices down the line that we don't even understand completely, but certainly continuing the CFD funding would be one of the options, as Mr. Haff said. So I could make a motion, if we're ready for that, to go along with the recommendation A and to form the JPA cooperative according to the current HCP schedule, March, April 2019, understanding that the HCP would be coming first and that the JPA may be a longer process.
I'll second that.
Okay, there's a motion by Director Reimers, seconded by Hoffa, to proceed with the HCP and to, I want to just clarify what you might mean by not delaying. So I think maybe it's to begin the discussions about what might be the terms and conditions of a JPA so that when the HCP is approved, we sincerely hope, that we're ready to then form the JPA. Great, okay.
So, question?
Yes.
So with that in mind, do we actually need the second part of the first sentence in A, beginning after form a JPA cooperative according to the current HCP schedule, etc., of March, April, and continue building the HCP endowments? Do we actually need, with HCP replacement funding mechanisms provided by the jurisdictions post FORA, or an extension of FORA financing authority? I don't think we need to have that clause in there, and I think if that were removed, it might make it a little cleaner.
And is that the intention of the maker of the motion?
May I ask the legal staff and Mr. Hillemard their reaction to whether that should be included or not?
I think that's a whole separate issue then, whether you want to form all this work. We're going to build the HCP endowments anyway, so this just continues the process that we're using. I do not believe that it affects us if you take the rest of that language out.
You would be doing, the endowment would be part of the HCP plan in any case, whether it's in the motion. Okay.
I'm sorry, could I ask it? You want a period after endowments? The follow-on items are part of the transition question anyway. That's, I think, if what you're trying to do is separate the two issues. I'm happy either way.
Okay, so at the moment, we have a motion to proceed with A through the word endowments. So just really looking at HCP, and with the understanding that we're proceeding with discussions and the framework for what the JPA would look like once that's...
We're not removing the continuing work for the JPA.
Right. Okay. Great. Okay, so Mr. Matarazzo, then Director Garfield, and then Director Morton, did you have your hand up? Or?
I did.
Okay.
What I heard the maker of the motion say is continuation of the CFD funding. So I think that could be in the motion. That can be with or without FORA Light, that you investigate continuing the area-wide CFD. And as you recall, the CFD is structured unlike many, where it's an assessment on property. This is a impact tax, impact fee. So rather than have several jurisdictions do it to developers, it's done area-wide.
Okay. Director Garfield, were you next?
Yes, so I'm sorry I got a little distracted here, but it seems to me that there are three things that, while investigating the terms of the HCPJPA, that there are three things that seem to be relevant, and one of them is the HMP funding that you've mentioned before, is what's necessary for the HMP that's a fallback plan. The second one is, what are the potential funding mechanisms that would be acceptable or match with the terms of the HCP? So I think that they're part of understanding the HCP and shouldn't be ignored, but they're just part of it.
Could you say the third one again? So you said the HCP and the JPA, the cost for the HMP.
Yeah, the cost of so there's several things that we've talked about aren't known.
I heard that. I
should be
just
understood.
want you to repeat the third one.
I'm working on it.
Thank you.
And the third one would be understanding the potential funding mechanisms post June 20th. And that would include percentages of a continuing fee that might go to that, just mechanisms that are potentially possible.
Thank you. And are you saying that rather than specifying that it would be the CFD, that we would look at the funding mechanisms?
Yes, I believe keeping as many options open as possible would be important.
Okay, thank you. Director Morton, you had something, or was it, and then Director Addis?
Go ahead.
Just, I'll be very frank. As you know, that there have been a lot of issues with all of the language that has been coming forward, and we've had county council looking at a lot of things. And I will believe I'm comfortable saying that I've just been, my comment has been underscored, that it is important to separate the two funding items. So I stick with what I had said, and if we all agree to that, then I'm happy.
Okay, so I think what I'm going to try to do here is, I think I want to break it into maybe a couple, 2 or 3 motions, so we can not get confused and tangled up, maybe. So I think there is a motion that started out being mostly, let's proceed with the HCP and continue discussions about what that JPA would look like, so we're ready in March or April, should that be approved.
And I did include the funding.
Yes, and I think we're going to we may have an issue with the funding issue, so what I'd like to do is have there be a motion that's about the JPA and the HCP and the JPA, and then we'll go to the funding motion.
So Chair Parker, I think I could propose an amendment that might address Director Adams' concern.
Okay.
And that would allow us to do it in one month. So what if we were to end after endowments and then add the following language, including an analysis of all potential funding mechanisms? So that kind of gets to what Director Garfield was talking about. Let's look at what our funding mechanisms might be. We're not specifying what it's going to be, but we're going to analyze it. So I don't know if the maker of the motion would be open to that amendment.
Yes, I'd be open to that. Thank you.
Okay, and as the seconder, I would agree to that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Director Morton.
So, in referring to paragraph A, if the maker of the motion, and maybe I didn't hear correctly, says form the JPA, as opposed to how Director Parker has indicated that we're going to continue to move forward with our base-wide HCP, continue to move forward with setting aside the 30% of every CFD for the funding of the HCP or HMP, and to look at what would be these in a JPA as necessary for an HCP, as opposed to actually forming it. I have a problem with the word form when I don't know what I'm agreeing to, so I can't obligate my city.
Okay, so I would agree that the part of what I heard Jonathan say was that we're not talking about forming the JPA yet. We're going to do that after the HCP. So I think your concern kind of gets to that question. So, yes, using
Madam Chair,
yes.
may I just clarify? My understanding is that the important factor here is to agree to and continue moving the HCP forward to meet the date that's listed on this document, and that during that time there will be work toward forming a JPA, that will be taking over and evaluating the opportunities for future funding going forward.
Great. So with that clarification, I think that's addressed.
Is that legally?
Yep. Are we all right? Okay. Good work, everyone. All right. Any further discussion? I guess I did have one question. There was discussion of, well, no, never mind. I won't bring it up. All right. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great. Thank you. Passes unanimously. And then I would just ask, I think there was I guess I would ask the maker of the friendly amendment, in your analysis of all potential funding mechanisms, is it your intention that through that the information will come forward about the potential cost of the HMP, should that become the fallback? Okay, great.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that's all reasonable. Okay.
Right. Feasible, semi-realistic. Okay, great, thank you. Good discussion. Now, we will move to new item 8B, which used to be consent item 7F. And this is the transition plan report and update. And I think, Director Adams, you were the one who pulled this. Do you want to, if you would frame your questions, and we'll see if other board members have questions. We'll see if the public has any questions, and then we'll see what we can do about getting a response.
Thank you, Chair Parker. There were a variety of things within the report that just gives me pause. And I think the primary thing is, again, I go back to where we were 2 weeks ago when we, and just citing the letter that we have from our county council October 11th, acknowledging that a lot of the concerns that we had are not addressed within the current document, particularly in the resolution. And I'm uneasy moving forward with accepting this because there is language within it that seems to indicate that if we just accept this today, this is what we're going to be moving forward with. You know, receive a report providing responses to the transition plan items from the September 28th special board meeting. There's still so many unaddressed and concerning issues within this. I question whether or not we've had the opportunity yet again to have county council, our council, sit with FORA staff, other members of Monterey County staff, and try to work through a lot of the concerns that we have. The other thing, and I think the basic thing that bothers me more than anything else, we are on a parallel track, which is absolutely perfect. One track is to seek legislation to get an extension. That's just fine. The other track, the transition plan track, is a transition plan that has FORA ending in 2020. And there is too much within this that is a crossover. So, whichever side of the track you're on, you can't mix the trains together on one track. You have to keep them separate. And I still feel that this does not do that. So that's the major concern that I have, and why I felt like it was important for us to pull this rather than just blindly go through and with consent, because I can say that we do not consent. So that's where I stand with this.
Great, thank you. Any other, yes, Director Garfield and then Director Morton.
I just want to chime in. I have some uneasiness about this as well. And Pacific Groves Council also weighed in. I sent him the transition plan and then the letter for the county council. And he has great agreement with the concerns raised by county council. And so I'm wondering if it's time to get the lawyers in the room with each other to figure out if they have agreement, if they don't have agreement, primarily around the issues of that is a trend that goes through many of these documents, many of these elements, is to what extent do the current agreements stay in force post FORA's dissolution? And is there a mechanism for doing that? Is there not a mechanism? Are there commitments that survive FORA? And all those issues that we can say we'd like for A to happen, but if there's no compelling mechanism, then we should be talking about why people would want to do it, not how they're being compelled to do it. And that's just a thread through all of this that I think we need to get out in front of.
Thank you. Director Morton?
So I did have some questions. One of the things that I wanted to know is if the attached resolution had been modified since our last meeting on September 28th. And if it's modified, we really should be able to see the red line changes something, because it's very difficult to try to see what happens from meeting to meeting. The second question that I had is the recommendation says receive a report providing responses to the transition plan items from the special board meeting. And I know the county sent in comments, City of Marina sent in comments. And is this indicating that those comments have all been addressed? Is there changes that are made? Because I don't see our Marina's issues being addressed or the county's issues being addressed. Or are you saying you're just addressing it in the staff report, which also is inadequate addressing of the issues? So those are my questions. And then, again, as to the comment, as Director Garfield just said, there are many things that the City of Marina does have an absolute interest in making sure that we work cooperatively with the county, with Seaside, with every jurisdiction to achieve what we want from the regional base for use plan and make sure that happens. But I do not agree with the assignment of these obligations, or that we can go forward with capital improvement programs being assigned without CEQA, without looking at it within the context of what's necessary under the traffic and circulation plans and the mitigations that are required in the base for use plan. So again, echoing what Director Adams just said, when we accept a report, we're kind of giving an indicia of approval of the content, and that is difficult for us in the City of Marina.
Thank you, Mr. Matarazzo, and then Director Edelin.
Regarding the
compile all
red
these
line
questions and
version of the
comments.
resolution, I would like to see that also, because I made a specific comment about assigned costs, and maybe I was dreaming, or maybe I was hoping I was getting through, but I saw a lot of nodding heads that these costs shouldn't be labeled costs, they should be labeled responsibilities, and they could be handled many ways, and that a capital improvement program's costs are not true costs, they're estimated costs. None of that's in this resolution.
Thank you. Director Edelin?
Okay, thank you. I know each of the directors here is looking after their own jurisdictions, and that's to be respected. And we all have, in some cases, conflicting interests. And I really don't think we're going to come to a 100% agreement on anything we do around this table, just from a historical point of view. But you have to look at this document, I think, from the fact we started off a couple of years ago, Transition Task Force, and we went to a Transition Ad Hoc Committee. Then we started from scratch and brought it back before this board to try and figure out what we want to do. And all we do, it seems like, is just talk and talk and talk and complain about what we don't have in common, and we don't get anywhere. And right now, look, we've got just until March of next year to come up with a plan. We've only got a couple months left. And I'd like to see, and this is not a criticism on anybody, rather than attacking the document. I think the document is an attempt at a straw man. Let's try and elucidate, explain what about the document you don't like, and come up with a recommendation on how you can make it work. We've got to work together to make it work, not complain, start from scratch, get some more lawyers, and not to complain about lawyers in a room. You can't get two lawyers to agree on anything, ever. And they're just going to run up billable hours. John, sorry about that. But we need to move forward. We need to get in a cooperative agreement on this thing, and we need to find the agreements between the jurisdictions where we can work together through HCP or ESCA or whatever. But we're running out of time. And in a perfect world, everything that's being said is right. We're not in a perfect world. We've got the sort of Damocles coming down on our head in a couple of months. We've got to make it work. Let's figure out a way what we like about this document, move it forward rather than it's all screwed up or whatever else. I think it's a good straw man.
Okay, thank you. Any other? Yes, Mr. Hawk.
Yeah, so I just want to say I do agree with Director Adams that we need to make sure we're following this dual pathway. On the one hand, we are, many of us are interested in pursuing some sort of extension legislation, but we also have to be prepared in 2020 in the event that that doesn't happen. So making sure that we have a transition post FORA that is going to work is very important. That being said, what I don't understand, and maybe my colleagues who are critical of this report could help clarify, exactly what is it that you want staff to do? Because as I understand it, the plan lays out where we think things should be transferred. We think that water, for example, should go to Marina Coast. We think that the transportation should go to PAMC. We think that habitat should go to a Habitat JPA or not, I guess. But I think it lays kind of that out. But then the implementation agreements are sort of the nuts and bones that say, yeah, here's the responsibility, here are the assets, here are the agreements. But those really have to, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those really need to be worked out between our mutual staffs. It's not really something that FORA, and if they did, I think people would be incensed. If they wrote the implementation agreements, then we'd be saying, why are you doing that? I don't want this responsibility. So I know that our city has given direction to our city manager to begin entering into conversation, for example, with Marina Coast. And it seems to me that that's where we should all be directing our staff to be working together on these implementation agreements. And maybe there is a place for FORA to assist in that. I think in the report it talks about the possibility of having a mediation, and for some reason that really isn't practical right now. I'm not sure that I completely agree with that. It seems like we should be able to hire somebody to help mediate. But anyway, I wished I could maybe hear some concrete. Am I wrong? Don't we all just need to get our staff talking to each other?
Thank you. Any other board members? Yes, Director Garfield.
I think you're absolutely right about getting at the appropriate people talking to each other. But I would also recognize that we've been saying that for months and months, and knowing what's a good mechanism for getting that started and knowing that it's on track. Because at a policy level, we can say, staff should be doing this, but they should have been doing this for a while. And so what are the steps that we as a board need to take to make sure that is in fact happening and know where it's not? so that gap stands out.
So maybe we could direct staff as part of this to reach out to the various jurisdictions and try to arrange meetings to discuss these various implementation agreements.
I think, yes, Director Adams?
You know, this is the second meeting that we have suggested that. In fact, as I
At
said,
least.
our county council has written a very thorough letter addressing a lot of the issues that we have. My hope and expectation was that that is step one, and step two was going to be this kind of discussion that you suggested, though that has not come to pass. So I concur that I think that's important. I also agree with you when you indicated that some kind of mediation has to be possible, you know, through, I think it's the Consensus Building Institute as an example. You know, there are places where a lot thornier issues than this, though I'm not sure, other than water, that there are any thornier than this one, that has worked. So I don't know why we are not doing both, why we are not gathering the key staff, and I would think county council as well as perhaps chief of staffs, however we want to do that, or our RMA, come together with the appropriate people from FORA, and I think legal counsel should be there, because I believe that a lot of the issues that are of great concern are just simply legal things that need to be worked out before we can get to the friendly, how are we all going to, you know, get along kind of thing. There's some very specific things that need to be addressed. So my hope is that we would do both of those things as we continue down these parallel paths.
So why don't we amend the report to include those directions?
So I was trying to collect questions for staff to respond to, but we've been doing some good problem solving in the meantime. So any other questions? Director Reimers.
Yes, my question that came up as I was reading this is, what did the implementation agreements that the jurisdictions that received property for FORA, what did they agree to, and how binding will that continue to be if we do continue on a light FORA going forward, which was suggested earlier by our colleague from Monterey? I think that's very important to understand, because it would seem to me that from what I have been listening to around the table in all these last months, going forward as a unit will be more beneficial than breaking into special groups for the near term, and that would be maybe 10 years, which is the number that's being batted around, for a light for it to go forward. I would be interested in knowing what the legal binding is on the implementation agreements that were signed by the jurisdictions when they started this process. At the same time, it would seem to me going forward, there needs to be benchmarks. There need to be goals set so that all the jurisdictions who do enter into going forward would have an expectation of being in charge of their own worlds. And I certainly understand that need. So I would hope that while we're looking at all of the options, that we're looking at the parallel tracks, but that we're actually looking seriously at integrating them at some point, if it does go forward, so that the transition plan, as it might be laid out, actually will be implemented by the continuation. If that makes any sense.
Thank you.
I would like to know what the agreements do bind them to.
Great, thank you. And I think, so any other questions for staff? And I just had one which may come out in some of these responses, is where are we with this facilitator concept? Because my sense is that FORA you've been doing your best effort to lay out the issues. I think now it's not so much that FORA has to enter into agreements with the jurisdictions. The jurisdictions need to work it out among themselves with the guidance of what the base reuse plan had in mind, and what the remaining work is to be done. So anyway, I would say, having a facilitator to work with the jurisdictions, just as an example, on ESCA, is it going to be the county taking the lead? Is it going to be Seaside? Are we going to form a JPA? Let's sit down and work that out. Some of these things hopefully are not terribly hard. There are going to be ones that are stickier, and see how close we can come. But so I'd like to know where we are on engaging the facilitator. With that, I think we'll just let you guys.
Well, from Authority Council's point of view, certainly are interested in sitting down with county council, who's raised the latest issues. I got the letter yesterday. Part of that letter includes the assignability question. Our office has come out with an opinion on that about a year ago that said that the implementation agreements are assignable. I know that the county council does not agree with that. That certainly would be a matter of a discussion. And as the plan has evolved, the issues continue to arise, and there are many of those weighty, unique issues based on the makeup of FORA being a regional planning body that is unique to California and most of the nation. So I'm very willing to sit down with lawyers and with the backing of staff. Sherry has been piloting this plan and collaborating with me on that. But I realize there are a lot of legal issues still outstanding, and we just need to get to work and address them.
I think staff would take the comments that have been brought forward as general direction to provide additional commentary for next week's special meeting on this particular issue. And since we made this an information action item, I believe the board wanted to give us this direction. It's completely appropriate. I also hear some rather specific questions that the attorneys need to address, and I believe, John, you're willing to sit down and talk with as many of the council representatives from the region that are interested. I thought we might take some initiative. I don't know that we can get a meeting together by next Friday. There are a broad series of questions that require some legal interpretation that have surfaced. They include, what is the authority to do an assignment? Although the language in the legislation says you shall assign for a board, there's interpretations that there is no authority to assign either with FORA or LAFCO by LAFCO's counsel. There seems to be some question about the assignability of the implementation agreements, about whether or not we can enter into other special agreements. However, what we would like to consider is giving us a little more direction. To give you a little more direction, we have Steve Ensley is preparing. Steve, I want to make sure I get this right. It's an RFQ for a facilitator, consultant, specialist. There's several that have indicated they might be interested. The Consensus Building Institute, the Concur, there's a number of folks that have contacted us when they heard this was a possibility. Concur guys are up in Santa Cruz, Consensus Building Institute, they're up in San Francisco, and we've talked to them before, by the way. They actually rejected a request we made of them to get involved 6 months ago. So we want to try this again. Defining what the role is to provide some support between the jurisdictions that have to put agreements together. There might be some help for as well, because as Dr. Moore knows, we need to think about the next steps in how MCWD takes over. And I see Todd over there. There might be some ways we work in agreement with TAMC on what happens with the regional roads. So there's a number of issues there that we've started on. And it would be happy to add that person. There is a time limit. I mentioned all of the problems associated with whether it's legally assignable or whether we have the authority to assign or LAFCO has the authority. But we have a time limit in state law. Senator Monning reminded me of it today, which is to provide a report to TAMC before the end of the year, actually a plan. LAFCO, excuse me, to LAFCO before the, I keep getting those confused because LAFCO tells us they have no jurisdiction over TAMC or the county or MCWD. I'm not sure what they mean by that. We'll figure it out later. But I do think there are two very positive things we can do. One, the attorneys should be talking. Maybe through conversation that might help, because if at the end of the day you have an obligation to do assignments and that and LAFCO's requiring you to give $350,000 to indemnify them, but nobody has any authority to do anything, I'm not sure why we're doing any of those things. It is very difficult for me to get my arms around taking those kinds of resources, spending all the time we're doing to adopt a plan, and there's no authority associated with it. It seems like, some would consider questionable use of public funds. And how do we make that work? So either there needs to be some additional definition or some agreement amongst the attorneys that what we can do is adopt a plan that sets forth in the future that all of you guys are going to agree that this is going to happen, and if you don't by a certain date, what that means. And county council might have an opinion that might be able to help us on this. Wendy's here today. She might be able to come up with some more brilliance like she did last week. So I believe that will take direction from the board by the comments that are made. We will continue to solicit for a professional, I'll call it facilitator, that would assist jurisdictions and maybe FORA in the individual agreements, and we'll bring back some additional comments for the board to chew on next week for 2 hours on Friday afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, yeah, I'm wondering, maybe we should hear from the public, and then bring it back to this board for further discussion, or are there board members who want to speak before that happens?
I just want to make a quick comment on Mr. Hobar's
Okay,
comment.
and
That is
actually,
that-
Director O'Connell asked first, so we'll let him speak, and then you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I just have one procedural thing that bothers me. It's a consent agenda, and it says basically it's a transition planning process update, and the recommendation on the front page says received a report providing responses to the transition plan. But then if you go on to page 21, it appears that the staff is making one of 3 recommendations as something to be considered. It just seems from the way in which the agenda is formed and what it's saying is a recommendation, we can't do anything other than what the agenda says, and that is receive the report. So either next time, if there is a next time, we list the recommendations 1, 2, and 3, or whatever they may be, on the front page of it, so that the public cannot later come back to us and say, where did you get the authority to do what you just did? Thank you.
That's a lot more important than what I was going to say, which is I just feel like we should clarify that on the 19th, the special meeting is not to approve the plan, but to further discuss the issues with the plan. Because I don't think we're going to be able to be there in a week.
Right. Yeah, that
Okay. Just
seems to
wanted
be
to make sure
floating
that was
in the air. Let's hear from the public, and then we'll bring it back for, what we are and aren't going to do today. So any member of the public wishing to comment on this item? All right, seeing no one, good. We will continue our discussion. Yes, Director Garfield.
Thank you. I wanted to underscore what Director Adams had brought up, is that the transition plan that we've been mandated to do is for an actual transition, come hell or high water. And that I would like to see a plan that is proposed to us next time that does not have as one of the recommendations a continuation of FORA as the best solution. It may be, but I truly think that we need to see what are the likely outcomes in each and every instance without FORA being there, to see how good, bad, or indifferent those options are. And I think that really fuels an intent to see the logic of having a continuation to do things that otherwise would be awful. So that's what I'd like to see more of, just separate.
Thank you. Any other directors want to weigh in? Yes, Director Alejo.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a comment that I addressed during our Board of Supervisors meeting, and that when I went back and looked at the legislative intent and history of the previous bill that extended FORA, the bill itself was never even marked fiscals, and it was never sent to the appropriations to do any analysis of what it would mean to try to assign obligations, responsibilities, liability to any successor agencies. It was not marked fiscal at all. And I'm sure when that bill came forward, well, I know for a fact that there was no discussion. The consultants never even evaluated when they talk about transition plan, and if that meant obligating other local governments to take on responsibilities of FORA without even considering what that cost is going to be. It was totally absent, and and as we all know in Sacramento, there's a legislative doctrine or principle that if you're gonna if the state government's going to approve legislation that imposes financial responsibilities on a local government, it's considered a mandate, right? And then the state has to make sure that it's going to be able to pay those local governments to carry out those new responsibilities that it's assigning through legislation. But I think that was one of the things that perhaps wasn't anticipated then. We have it now because we're going through this whole process of looking at a transition plan. The cost and responsibilities are becoming much clearer. But I just wanted to point out to everyone that was completely void when we approved the extension in 2013, I believe it was.
Okay. Anyone else wanting to comment? Okay, so staff, you have some good questions, a bit of direction. Oh, hello. And in addition to the comments that have been made, I would just say that it would, I think, behoove FORA, if you haven't already, to circle back with LAFCO and get very clear on what LAFCO feels would be something that would be acceptable to them in December. We need to give them something, I believe, and we've been aiming to get something that's pretty comprehensive, but I don't know that we're going to have everything nailed down by December, so I think it would be a good idea to check in with them and find out. I think a couple of us have said a couple of times, maybe there's a way to submit something that lays out the issues, as FORA has done, and then said, this negotiation is happening between so-and-so and so-and-so, and we anticipate it to be resolved by such and such a date. I don't know if that would be acceptable to LAFCO, but I think we're getting close to the time we better find out, because that may be as much as we're going to have. And if that is going to be a problem, then we need to think about how often a bunch of people can get together between now and the end of December. All right, and I think facilitator. Good. All right, I think that's it. Now, this was listed as information action. I've heard a reluctance to take any action on this, so I think we'll just deem it given to us and discussed. Anything, let's see, so probably we need to move to something like general public comment at this point.
One last comment to that.
Sure.
So
Director Moore.
for next Friday, it would be really beneficial, and I know in the city of Marina, our city manager is reached out to Seaside City Manager and to, it's the equivalent for the county, CIO. And the point is, it'd be much more beneficial for all of us moving forward if those individuals could also be here next Friday and indicate to us how those negotiations, what they've identified is where the agreements need to be fostered and done, so that I, as a city, know the county is looking for a contribution from Marina's development CFD, because we are anticipating replacing that, for X, Y, and Z, and a reciprocity, what does Marina want, or Seaside. Getting to those kinds of specifics will be much more beneficial for anybody trying to facilitate what's in these memorandums of agreement, because right now it's a very nebulous, overly broad topic. So I look forward to having, and I think my city manager is here, extending that. I'm asking every jurisdiction to do the same. Your admin committee member is your city manager, so they're keenly aware of these issues. They discuss them every 2 weeks.
Great, thank you. Anyone else before we leave this endless topic for today? All right, good. Then next on our agenda is public comment. Is there any member of the public who would like to address the FORA board on any item not on today's agenda? All right, seeing no one coming forward. Any items from members? anything going on you want to let us know about? Yes.
So the city of Monterey did discuss this at a recent meeting, and we are submitting, I don't know if it's been received yet, but we are also submitting a resolution regarding transition.
Great. Thank you. Yes, Director Garfield.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I've seen that there have been a number of hearings and discussions among the land use jurisdictions. Is there a logical way for that to be shared with the rest of us so that we all understand? Can you do that? That would be very helpful. Thank you. Good thought.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Good discussion, and we are adjourned.